Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of Joachim Kroll, the man the world would come to know as the Ruhr Hunter. We begin our journey in the summer of 1976, in the heart of West Germany. Picture, if you will, the town of Duisburg. It is a landscape defined by the heavy, rhythmic pulse of industry. The skyline is a jagged silhouette of blast furnaces, coking plants, and towering chimneys that bleed charcoal-colored smoke into the hazy twilight. In this part of the world, the air always carries a faint, metallic tang, a mixture of iron dust and coal soot that settles like a fine shroud over the cobblestones and the brick facades of the worker housing. It is a place of hard labor and quiet evenings, where the hum of the steel mills provides a constant, low-frequency background noise to the lives of thousands. July of 1976 was particularly oppressive. A heat wave had settled over the Ruhr Valley, turning the narrow streets into canyons of stagnant, shimmering air. On the 3rd of July, the sun beat down with a relentless intensity that drove most residents indoors or toward the shade of the local parks. Among the residents was a 4-year-old girl named Marion Ketter. She was a bright, blonde child, full of the innocent energy that defines early childhood. On that Saturday afternoon, she was dressed simply in her light blue panties, trying to stay cool while she played near her home. But as the afternoon shadows began to stretch across the pavement, the playful sounds of the neighborhood were replaced by a sudden, chilling silence. Marion had vanished, seemingly swallowed by the thick, summer haze. Not far from where Marion had been playing stood an unremarkable apartment building at number 24 Friesenstrasse. It was a place of shared spaces and thin walls, where neighbors knew the rhythms of each other's lives by the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the clatter of dishes. In this building lived a man named Joachim Kroll. He was 43 years old, a squat, broad-shouldered man with a face that many described as honest, if somewhat simple. He worked as a toilet attendant and later for the local industries, a quiet figure who often gave candy to the neighborhood children. They called him Uncle Joachim. He was the kind of person who faded into the background, a dull thread in the vibrant fabric of the community. Yet, on this specific afternoon, something was very wrong inside the pipes of number 24. A neighbor living in the same block had been struggling with a frustrating problem. The communal waste pipes were severely blocked, causing an unpleasant backup that could not be ignored. When he encountered Joachim Kroll in the hallway, the neighbor asked if he had any idea what might be causing the obstruction. Kroll looked at him with an unsettling, flat calm. Without a flicker of hesitation or a hint of a joke, he replied with a single word: guts. He claimed he had been cleaning a rabbit and had tried to dispose of the remains down the toilet. The neighbor, taken aback by the bluntness and the sheer oddity of the statement, did not know whether to laugh or feel a prickle of dread. But as the news of little Marion's disappearance began to circulate through the building, that small, strange interaction began to take on a terrifying new weight. By the time the sun began to dip below the industrial horizon, the police were moving through the neighborhood, conducting a frantic door-to-door search for the missing girl. Detective Max Reese was among those tasked with questioning the residents of Friesenstrasse. When they reached the 4th floor and spoke to the neighbor with the plumbing issues, the story of the blocked pipes and Kroll's casual comment reached the ears of the authorities. It was a lead born of pure chance, a moment where the mundane reality of a broken drain collided with the unthinkable. The officers climbed the stairs to apartment number 7, the small, cramped residence of Joachim Kroll. The air in the hallway felt heavy, charged with a tension that seemed to vibrate in time with the distant thud of the steel works. When Kroll opened the door, there was no sign of panic. He stood there in his small kitchen, a space filled with the thick, cloying steam of something cooking on the stove. The detective stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. On the burner, a large pot was simmering, and as the steam cleared, the horrific reality of the situation began to unfold. In the refrigerator and scattered across the small room were the remains of little Marion Ketter, the man who had been a quiet neighbor for years, the man who had avoided detection for over 2 decades, stood calmly amidst the evidence of his depravity. This discovery would not only end the life of the Ruhr hunter's final victim, but would tear open a history of violence that had haunted the region since 1955. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the unsettling calm of Friesenstrasse was forever broken. The steam in that kitchen was thick, a heavy curtain that obscured the face of the man standing there. But to truly see Joachim, we must pull that curtain back, much further than that night in 1976. We must travel across the borders of time and geography, back to a place of soot and silence. To understand the shadow in the kitchen, we must first look at the boy in the snow. Joachim was born on April 17, 1933, in the town of Hindenburg, which we now know as Zabrze, in the region of Upper Silesia. It was a land dominated by the towering silhouettes of coal mines and the rhythmic, industrial heartbeat of the earth. The air there was often gray, tasting of iron and dust, and for a child like Joachim, the world felt just as heavy and unyielding as the coal his father pulled from the deep. He was the 6th of 9 children, or perhaps the 8th, depending on which dusty record you believe. In a house filled with so many siblings, one might expect noise and vibrant life, but for Joachim, there was only a growing sense of isolation. His father was a miner, a man whose life was measured in shifts and darkness. The family was poor, and the home was cramped, a place where privacy was a luxury and attention was a rare commodity. Joachim was a small child, physically weaker than his peers, with ears that seemed a little too large and a constitution that invited the cruelty of other children. He was a boy who lived in the margins of his own family, a quiet observer of a world that didn't seem to have a place for him. School offered no sanctuary. In the classroom, the words on the page remained a blur, a puzzle he couldn't solve. His intelligence was later measured with an IQ of 76, a number that placed him on the edge of what society deemed capable. He struggled to keep up, eventually falling away from his education after only 3 years of primary school. He was semi-literate, a boy who could barely read the signs on the street or the labels on the shelves. But it wasn't just the lack of learning that isolated him, it was the shame. Joachim suffered from chronic bedwetting well into his adolescent years. Imagine the cold, damp sheets in the middle of a Silesian winter, the sharp scent of ammonia, and the biting humiliation that followed every morning. It was a secret that kept him from making friends, a physical manifestation of an internal failure that he could never outrun. As the 1930s bled into the chaos of the 1940s, the world outside Upper Silesia began to burn. The Second World War tore through the landscape, but for the Kroll family, the true shift came at the end of the conflict. Joachim's father was taken as a prisoner of war by the Russians, a figure of authority vanishing into the vastness of the East, never to return to the family home. By 1947, the borders of Europe were being redrawn with ink and blood. Upper Silesia was no longer German territory. The Kroll family, like so many others, were displaced, forced to leave the only home they had ever known. They moved west, towards the industrial heart of West Germany, eventually settling in North Rhine-Westphalia. They were refugees in their own culture, carrying only what they could fit in their hands and the heavy silence of their losses. They arrived in a land of ruins and reconstruction. In the town of Duisburg, the family lived in a cramped 2-room apartment, 8 of them sharing a space meant for 2. Joachim was now a young man in years, but a child in mind. He moved through the streets of West Germany like a ghost, a short, balding figure who spoke little and understood even less of the social cues that governed the people around him. He found work where he could, usually in positions that required no words and no skill, cleaning toilets for manufacturing giants like Thyssen and Mannesmann. He was the man who scrubbed the floors and emptied the bins, the man nobody looked at twice. But in that invisibility, a dark curiosity began to take root. He spent his meager earnings on electronic gadgets and dolls, surrounding himself with objects that couldn't judge his silence or his shame. The year 1955 would become the pivot point of his life. It was the year his mother died, the one anchor he had in a world that felt increasingly alien. When she passed, something inside Joachim seemed to snap, or perhaps it finally found the permission to emerge. He was 22 years old, living in a world he didn't understand, fueled by a deep-seated resentment and a burgeoning, twisted hunger. He began to wander the secluded paths and the wooded edges of the Ruhr Valley, watching and waiting. The boy from Upper Silesia, the one who had been bullied for his wet sheets and his slow mind, was learning a new language, a language of shadow and of the hunt. The kitchen in Duisburg was still years away, but the pot was already on the stove, and the fire was beginning to burn. The winter of 1955 was a season of iron and ice in the Ruhr Valley. The air hung heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the damp, biting mist that rolled off the Rhine River. For Joachim, the world had become a hollow place following the passing of his mother. The quiet of their shared home felt less like peace and more like a void that needed to be filled with something tangible, something sharp. He began to wander the outskirts of Walsum, his footsteps heavy on the frozen mud, his mind drifting toward a darkness that had been simmering beneath his shy, stuttering exterior for years. It was in this state of quiet agitation that he encountered Erika Willems on the 8th of February. She was only 19 years old, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, walking through the fading light of a late Tuesday afternoon. The trees in the woods near the path stood like skeletal sentinels, their bare branches clicking together in the wind, whispering secrets that only the desperate could hear. Erika was making her way home, perhaps thinking of the warmth of a stove or the simple comforts of the evening ahead. She could not have known that a shadow was detached from the deeper gloom of the forest. Joachim watched her. He noted the way her breath bloomed in the cold air, white plumes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. There was no grand plan, no complex conspiracy in his mind. There was only a sudden, pulsing need to exert a final, terrible control. He stepped from the brush, the sound of his movement masked by the rustle of the wind. Before Erika could cry out, before the peaceful silence of the rural path could be broken by anything more than a gasp, he was upon her. The struggle was brief, muffled by the heavy winter coats they both wore. In that moment, the 19-year-old man transformed into something the world was not yet prepared to name. He used his hands, his strength fueled by a lifetime of perceived inadequacy, and let the darkness take hold. When the life finally faded from Erika's eyes, a profound and terrifying stillness settled over the clearing. Joachim stood over her, the only sound the distant whistle of a train and the pounding of his own heart. This was the departure from grace he had subconsciously craved. But the murder was only the beginning of the horror. In the deep shadows of the 1955 woods, Joachim began to explore the morbid curiosities that had haunted his dreams. He performed acts of desecration that would later become his gruesome signature, driven by a hunger that was as much physical as it was psychological. He spent a long time there, lost in the ritual, seemingly invisible to the world outside the tree line. The textures of the earth, the coldness of the skin, the absolute silence of the victim. These details burned themselves into his memory, forming a blueprint for the 20 years of predation that were to follow. Eventually, the cold began to seep into his own bones, and the reality of what he had done forced him to move. He left Erika there, a tragic figure resting on the cold ground, and walked back toward the lights of the town. He did not run. He did not panic. He simply slipped back into the skin of the quiet, dim-witted laborer that everyone believed him to be. When her body was discovered, the shock through the community was profound. Walsall was a place where people knew their neighbors, where the industrial grind of the post-war era provided a predictable rhythm to life. A murder of such brutality felt like a rupture in the fabric of reality. The police arrived with their flashbulbs and their notebooks, but the science of the mid-50s was a blunt instrument compared to the sharp precision of the killer's invisibility. They looked for fingerprints on rough fabric where none could stay. They looked for witnesses in a forest that kept its mouth shut. Joachim was actually questioned in the aftermath. To the investigators, he appeared exactly as he always had. Slow, perhaps a bit simple, and utterly unremarkable. He lacked the typical profile of a violent predator. In 1955, the world believed that monsters looked like monsters, scarred, hulking, or obviously depraved. They did not expect a monster to have the face of a man who worked in a power plant and lived a life of quiet isolation. Because there was no direct forensic link, no blood typing that could pinpoint him, no DNA technology to speak of, the police eventually looked elsewhere. They focused on more likely suspects, men with records or loud tempers. Joachim watched from the periphery, learning a dangerous lesson, that if one is quiet enough, and if one appears small enough, the world will look right through you. He had crossed the threshold, and the lack of consequences felt like a permission slip from the universe to continue his descent. The case of Erica Willems eventually grew cold, joining the tragic archives of unsolved mysteries that haunt small towns. But for Joachim Kroll, the memory of that February evening remained vivid. It was the moment he realized he could take what he wanted and remain hidden in plain sight. The departure from Grace was complete. As the snow began to melt into the spring of 1956, the blood on the forest floor was washed away, but the hunger within him only grew. He had tasted a power that his mundane life could never provide, and he knew now that he would seek it again. He returned to his routines, punching his time card, eating his simple meals, and nodding to his neighbors, all while carrying the secret of the 19-year-old girl in the woods. The spree had begun, and for the next 2 decades, the shadows of the Ruhr would grow much, much longer. The industrial heart of West Germany in the middle of the 20th century was a landscape defined by iron, steam, and soot. For a man like Joachim Kroll, it was the perfect place to drift into the background. Around 1960, he settled into the city of Duisburg, specifically the suburb of Lahr. It was a place where the air was often thick with the scent of coal and the constant, low-frequency hum of heavy machinery. He moved into a modest apartment on Friesenstrasse, a narrow street lined with brick buildings that seemed to absorb the gray light of the Ruhr Valley. To his neighbors, he was a nonentity, a man who moved with a quiet, shuffling gait and rarely met anyone's gaze. He was the kind of person you would pass on the sidewalk 1,000 times and never truly remember. This invisibility was his greatest tool, a cloak woven from the threads of a perfectly ordinary, even pitiable existence. His work life was a series of menial tasks that required very little of his mind and even less social interaction. He found employment as a laborer and a kitchen helper, but his most consistent role was that of a restroom attendant at the Mannesmann Steelworks. Imagine the environment where he spent his long hours. The rhythmic, hollow dripping of water against cold, white porcelain, the sharp, medicinal sting of industrial bleach, and the flickering, yellow hum of long fluorescent tubes overhead. He spent his days scrubbing tiles and polishing mirrors, his own reflection appearing as a pale, indistinct smudge in the glass. Workers would move in and out, ignoring the man with the mop, treating him as though he were merely another fixture of the building's plumbing. He was a silent witness to the daily routines of hundreds of men, a shadow in the corner of a tiled room, unnoticed and dismissed. In the neighborhood around Friesenstrasse, the locals eventually gave him a nickname. They called him Jogi, or sometimes Uncle Joachim. To the parents on his street, He seemed like a simple, harmless bachelor who perhaps just lacked the wit or the drive to build a family of his own. He was known to carry small candies or inexpensive toys in his pockets, which he would offer to the children playing in the courtyards. He appeared to be a man who simply wanted to be liked, a quiet soul who was fond of the innocence of youth. He would often defy the strict rules of the apartment building to let the local children into his flat to see his latest electronic gadgets. In their eyes, he was merely an eccentric neighbor, a bit slow perhaps, but fundamentally kind. They had no way of knowing that the toys and the kindness were a calculated front for a predator who found safety in the guise of the village idiot. Inside his small apartment at number 11 Friesenstrasse, the atmosphere was vastly different from the public persona he maintained. The rooms were cramped and filled with an odd assortment of items. While he was frugal to the point of obsession with his food and clothing, he spent his meager earnings on modern electronic devices and a collection of inflatable dolls. These dolls were not mere toys. They were the tools of a dark rehearsal. In the silence of his flat, away from the prying eyes of the neighbors who thought him so pleasant, he would practice his grim compulsions. The walls held the secrets of his internal world, a place where the mundane worker transformed into something far more clinical and cold. He lived a life of extreme contrast, the public restroom attendant who cleaned up after others, and the private man who carefully curated a gallery of the macabre. During the 1960s and early 1970s, the newspapers were often filled with reports of the Ruhr Hunter, a nameless specter responsible for a string of disappearances and tragedies. The public was on edge, watching the shadows for a monster. Yet no one looked at Joachim Kroll. He was too short, too quiet, and far too ordinary to fit the profile of a master of the dark. When the police questioned people in the area about suspicious characters, the name Jogi never came up. He would sit in his apartment, perhaps listening to the same news reports on his radio, while the very evidence of his crimes was tucked away in his kitchen or hidden within the mundane clutter of his life. He found that if you are unremarkable enough, the world will invent a version of you that is safe, allowing the true version to operate in total darkness. His movements through Duisburg were guided by the geography of his low-profile existence. He took the trains and buses, blending into the morning rush of blue-collar workers. He walked through the public parks and along the banks of the River Rhine, observing the world with a detached, predatory patience. He was a master of the slow burn, a man who could wait years between his most violent impulses, returning always to the comfort of his cleaning supplies and his silent apartment. This ability to maintain a facade of complete boredom was his most effective camouflage. As the years turned into decades, the shadow of Joachim Kroll grew longer, stretching across the industrial landscape of the Ruhr, hidden in plain sight by the very banality of the life he chose to lead. He was the neighbor you never feared, the worker you never saw, and the man who kept the darkest secrets behind a door that everyone was welcome to enter. The year 1957 marked a subtle but dark shift for Joachim Kroll. He arrived in the city of Duisburg, a place where the air was thick with a blue-gray haze and the constant, iron-tasting dust of the heavy industries. He found work in the very bowels of the city, often as a toilet attendant, a position that allowed him to remain utterly invisible. He was a shadow among the thousands of weary workers who kept the Ruhr region humming with their labor. But as the decade turned toward 1959, his focus began to drift away from the crowded city centers. He sought the quiet, green fringes of the industrial landscape, exploring the meadows and the riverbanks where the rhythmic clanking of the steel mills faded into the soft rustle of tall grass and the steady flow of water. It was in these transitions between the urban grit and the natural world that his true patterns began to emerge. In June of 1959, the meadows of the Rhine near Rheinhausen were lush and deep, hiding the scars of the nearby factories. On the 16th of June, a warm Tuesday, the humid air hung heavy over the river. Clara Frietta Tesmer, a 24-year-old woman with blonde hair, was walking near the Moerserstrasse, within sight of the Great Graf Spee Bridge. Kroll watched her from the shadows of the high grass, moving with the silent, predatory patience he had honed since his youth. When he struck, it was a sudden, violent eruption in an otherwise peaceful afternoon. They rolled down the embankment together toward the cooling waters of the Rhine. When 5 boys on their bicycles discovered her the following morning, the meadows were silent once more, but the safety of the riverbank had vanished. Tragically, an innocent mechanic would later be arrested for this crime, becoming one of many men whose lives were ruined by Kroll's ability to vanish into the scenery. Only a month later, in July of 1959, Kroll turned his gaze toward the city park of Essen. This was a place of manicured lawns and family strolls, a rare haven of beauty in the heart of the Ruhr, yet it held pockets of deep, artificial isolation. 16-year-old Manuela Knott was enjoying the park's greenery when the hunter found her. It was here that Kroll's actions took on a more ritualistic and horrific tone. He began to treat his victims not just as targets of opportunity, but as a strange form of sustenance. He removed sections of flesh from her body, a practice he would later justify with a chilling sense of frugality during his leanest times. The discovery of Manuela sent a ripple of absolute terror through Essen. The parks, once seen as essential escapes for the working class to breathe fresh air, were now viewed as dangerous labyrinths where a monster might be waiting behind every manicured hedge. The pattern continued into the early 1960s, with the attacks growing more frequent and bold. In April of 1962, on Easter Monday, the focus shifted to the dense forest outside of Dinslaken-Bruckhausen. The woods were waking up for the spring, the ground covered in the damp decay of winter leaves and the first tender green shoots. 13-year-old Petra Gies had been enjoying the festive atmosphere of a local fair before she was lured into the trees. Kroll used the environment to his absolute advantage, the thick foliage providing a heavy curtain for his cruelty. He used Petra's own red scarf as a garrote, a sensory detail that remains haunting, the softness of the wool contrasting with the cold, hard reality of the violence. When she was found the next day among the low-hanging bushes, the brutality of the scene left the entire community paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend such a predatory presence in their midst. In June of 1962, another young life was taken in Walsum. 12-year-old Monika Tafel became the next name in Kroll's grim and growing ledger. By now, his method was becoming horrifyingly refined. He sought out the most vulnerable, the young, the solitary, and those who trusted the familiarity of their own neighborhoods. He would carry portions of his victims back to his small, cramped apartment on Friesenstrasse, where he lived a life of quiet, terrifying domesticity. To his neighbors, he was merely an unremarkable, balding man who kept to himself, perhaps a bit slow, perhaps a bit odd, but fundamentally harmless. They walked past his door every day, never imagining that the steam rising from his cooking pot carried the evidence of his crimes. He was a master of the mundane, using his low-profile existence as a shield, while he hunted the very people who lived and played just streets away from his own home. The tragedy of this period was compounded by the failures of the local authorities. Because Kroll was so unremarkable and moved so freely across different jurisdictions by bus and train, the police often focused their suspicion on men who were already known to them. In the wake of the attacks in Dinslaken and Walsum, innocent men were hounded by both the law and their own neighbors. One man, Walter Quicker, was so tormented by the weight of false accusation and the harassment of his community that he chose to end his own life rather than face the shame of a crime he did not commit. Kroll watched these developments from afar, a ghost in the industrial machinery of the Ruhr. He knew the quiet trails, the shortcuts through the empty industrial lots, and the hidden paths in the woods better than any detective. He was the Ruhr hunter, a creature born of the soot, the silence, and the indifference of a busy world. Imagine the landscape of the Ruhr Valley in the 1960s. It was a place defined by heavy industry, a sprawling network of coal mines and steel mills that breathed a constant haze of gray into the sky. The air often tasted of metallic dust and damp earth, and when the evening fog rolled in from the Rhine, it settled over the towns of Duisburg, Essen, and Bottrop like a heavy, suffocating blanket. In this era, the borders between these cities were physically invisible, yet for the local police forces, they were like fortress walls. Each municipality operated its own department, guarded its own records, and followed its own leads. A tragedy in one district was rarely discussed in the next, and this fragmentation created a series of dark pockets where a man like Joachim Kroll could comfortably exist. There was no thread tying the victims together, no central eye looking down at the map to see the golden needle stitching these patterns into a single, terrifying tapestry. Inside the police stations of the time, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the rhythmic clacking of manual typewriters. Investigators worked under the dim, yellow glow of flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by mountains of manila folders and hand-drawn maps pinned to cork boards. In this pre-digital age, a piece of evidence was only as useful as the person who held the paper. If a witness in the town of Rheinhausen described a short, unremarkable man with a soft voice, that description would be carefully logged in a ledger, filed into a steel cabinet, and potentially never cross the desk of an officer just 15 miles away in Wuppertal. The data was siloed, trapped in drawers of heavy oak and iron, awaiting a connection that the technology of the 1960s simply could not provide. Without a centralized computer system to flag the similarities in these crimes, the investigators were effectively searching for a phantom in a house of mirrors. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these failed connections was the human cost of the police's desperation. Because the authorities were under immense pressure to find a monster, they often cast their gaze toward the people closest to the victims. We think of Heinrich Ott, a simple mechanic whose life was caught in the gears of a system that was hungry for a culprit. In 1959, he was arrested and accused of a crime he did not commit. The weight of the community's sudden hatred and the isolation of a cold cell became a burden too heavy to carry. He ended his own life while in custody, a tragic shadow left in the wake of Kroll's true darkness. He was not the only one. Others, like Adolf Skickel and Walter Quicker, would find their reputations shredded and their spirits broken by the suspicion of their neighbors. These men were victims of the gap in the system, collateral damage in a hunt that was looking in every direction except toward the quiet man in the washroom. Joachim Kroll himself was a phantom of the mundane. He worked as a washroom attendant at a large industrial plant, a position that allowed him to vanish into the background of daily life. To his coworkers and neighbors, he was merely the quiet man who kept to himself, the one who cleaned the tiles and mopped the floors while the rest of the world moved on in a hurry. This invisibility was his greatest defense. The police of the 1960s were looking for a mastermind, a towering figure of evil, or a recognizable deviant. They were not looking for a man of limited words and simple habits, someone who moved through the gray streets of North Rhine-Westphalia with the total anonymity of a ghost. His very lack of personality made him impossible to profile during a time when criminal psychology was still in its infancy. He was a face in the crowd that no one remembered, even when he stood right next to them. The sheer geographic spread of his actions added a final layer of confusion to the investigation. 1 month he might strike in the quiet woods of Dinslaken, and then several years would pass before he surfaced again in a city park in Essen. By constantly changing his locations and his victims, alternating between small children and grown women, he shattered any traditional sense of a criminal pattern. To the overworked investigators, These appeared to be isolated incidents of random, senseless violence rather than the deliberate acts of a single predator. They were looking for a straight line in a world of scattered dots, never realizing that the man they sought was traveling the local railway lines between their jurisdictions with chilling ease. He was a passenger on their trains, a customer in their shops, and a neighbor in their buildings, all while the files on his crimes sat cold and disconnected in separate offices across the valley. As the decade drew to a close, the stack of unsolved cases continued to grow, each one a silent testament to the gaps in communication. The tragedy was further compounded by the fact that other violent offenders were active in the Ruhr region during this same era. This created a cacophony of crime that effectively masked Kroll's specific movements. Like a radio tuned to static, the police could not hear the specific frequency of his killings over the noise of so many other tragedies. They were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of shadows in the industrial heartland. And so, the man who would later be known as the Ruhr Hunter remained a nameless fear, a monster hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one small, domestic mistake that would finally bring the walls of his secrecy crashing down. For now, the silence between the police stations remained, and the predator continued to walk the foggy streets of the 1960s, unnoticed and unstopped. The air in Duisburg during the 1960s and 70s was never truly clear. It was a thick, heavy blanket of industrial breath, carrying the heavy scent of coal dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the great steelworks. To live here was to live in a world defined by shades of gray, where the soot settled on the windowsills like a fine, dark snow every morning. In this landscape of rhythmic machinery and towering chimneys, it was easy for a man to become a ghost. This was the home of the man the world would later know by many terrifying names, but to those who shared his street, he was simply a quiet, unremarkable neighbor. He was the invisible man of Duisburg, a figure who walked the soot-stained pavements every day, carrying a darkness so profound it was shielded by the very simplicity of his existence. He was the man you would see at the edge of your vision, a flickering shadow against the red glow of the blast furnaces, blending into the smog of the Ruhr Valley. At the Mannesmann Steelworks, the heat from the furnaces was a constant companion, vibrating through the metal floorboards. Amidst the deafening roar of production, Joachim Kroll held a position that many would find invisible by its very nature. He was a toilet attendant, a man whose work kept him in the damp, tiled corners of the industrial complex. To his coworkers, he was a weaselly, short man with a balding head and a face that seemed to melt into the background of the factory. He was thin, a bit awkward in his movements, and possessed a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. He was the kind of person you might pass 1,000 times and never truly see. They saw him as a simpleton, a man of limited words and even more limited intellect. In the hierarchy of the factory, he was at the bottom, a quiet soul who performed his menial tasks without complaint. He was so unassuming that he seemed incapable of harboring a single secret, let alone a life of unspeakable horror. When the whistle blew and the shifts ended, Joachim would make his way back to his modest apartment on Friesenstrasse, house number 11. The street was lined with narrow, sturdy buildings, their facades darkened by years of exposure to the valley's industry. Inside his small flat, the world was silent. There were no grand luxuries here. He lived a life of extreme frugality, a life that seemed to be a series of repetitive, lonely rituals. The wallpaper was yellowed with age, and the air often smelled of the simple meals he prepared, mostly boiled potatoes and thin, watery broths. He was a man who watched every penny, a man who seemed to have no room for the complexities of adult relationships or the messy emotions of the world outside. To an outsider looking in, his life was one of profound, almost tragic, boredom. But behind those thin walls, the shadows were deep. He kept a collection of dolls, and he surrounded himself with electronic gadgets strange, modern relics in a home that otherwise felt stuck in a different era. The children of the neighborhood knew him differently. To them, he was not the silent worker from the steelworks, but Uncle Joachim. He was a source of small, frequent kindnesses in a hard-working town where parents were often exhausted. He would reach into his pockets and pull out candy for the little ones, or he would show the young girls the dolls he kept in his apartment, inviting them in to play despite the building's rules. The parents of Friesenstrasse saw him as a harmless, perhaps slightly pitiable figure. He was the man who never quite grew up, a town idiot of sorts who seemed to find his only true comfort in the company of children. He was helpful, he was polite, and he never caused trouble. If a pipe was blocked or a chore needed doing, Joachim was often there, a shadow of a man who seemed to crave a family of his own but was too broken to ever form one. They felt safe with him because he seemed so utterly incapable of malice, his low intelligence acting as a mask that no one thought to look behind. Psychologists would later marvel at how a man with an intelligence quotient of 76 could evade the authorities for over 20 years. In the eyes of the law, a serial killer was often imagined as a brilliant, calculating mastermind, a predator who outsmarted the police with intricate games. But Joachim was the absolute opposite. He was a man of barely a third-grade education, a person who struggled to understand the complex consequences of his actions. Yet this very limitation was his greatest defense. The police were looking for a wolf, not a rabbit. They were searching for someone clever enough to plan, not someone who acted on primal, distorted impulses that left a trail of chaos. His lack of intelligence made him invisible to suspicion. He did not fit the profile because he was too simple to be a monster. He was a man who committed acts not out of a grand design, but because of a dark, internal hunger that he could neither control nor fully comprehend. The most chilling aspect of his invisibility was the way he justified his horrors to himself with the logic of a man who had nothing. He would later claim, with a disturbing nonchalance, that he took the flesh of his victims to save money on his grocery bills. In his mind, the act was intertwined with the mundane struggle of the working class. He lived in a world where meat was a luxury, and in his twisted logic, he was simply being resourceful. This chilling blend of the horrific and the domestic is what allowed him to remain hidden for so long. He would return from a night of terror and go to work the next morning, scrubbing floors and cleaning basins at the plant as if nothing had happened. He would greet his neighbors with a polite tip of his hat, all while the remnants of his crimes were tucked away in his kitchen. He was a man who lived two lives that were perfectly separated by a veil of total normalcy, a man who saw no contradiction between being a friendly neighbor and a consumer of human souls. As the years turned into decades, the list of missing persons grew, yet no one looked at the quiet man on Friesenstrasse. He was the background noise of the city, a face in the crowd that left no impression. He was the hunter who looked like the prey. In the gray light of Duisburg, Joachim Kroll proved that the most dangerous monsters are not those who hide in the deep woods, but those who stand right next to us in the grocery line. He was a master of a disguise he did not even know he was wearing, the disguise of being completely, utterly ordinary. The steel mills continued to churn, the soot continued to fall, and the invisible man continued to walk the streets, a ghost among the living. The air in the Ruhr Valley during the late summer of 1966 carried a heavy, humid weight, the kind that settles deep into the lungs and makes every movement feel deliberate. In the town of Marl, the tall trees of Forsterbusch Park provided a respite from the industrial heat. It was a place of winding paths and dense thickets, where the shadows of the oaks stretched long across the damp earth as the sun began its slow descent. On the evening of September 13, 1966, the park was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the rustle of leaves beginning to turn gold. Ursula Rolling, a vibrant 20-year-old woman, walked through these shadows, unaware that the quiet man who had been haunting the periphery of the industrial towns had now found his way to her sanctuary. She had spent her evening in the most ordinary of ways, sharing ice cream and conversation with her boyfriend, Adolf Skickel. They had spoken of the future, perhaps of marriage and a life away from the grit of the factories, before parting ways for the night. It was a simple, tender goodbye that would haunt the town for years to come. 2 days passed before the silence of the park was broken by a gruesome discovery. Ursula's body was found deep within the undergrowth, tucked away in a place where the light rarely touched the forest floor. She had been strangled, her life extinguished in a sudden, violent blur that contrasted sharply with the peaceful surroundings. But what truly chilled the investigators was the way she had been left. She was posed in a manner that felt both clinical and depraved, a signature of the man the world would later know as the Ruhr Hunter. At the time, however, the police did not see a serial predator. They did not look toward the nondescript lavatory attendant from Duisburg who moved through the world like a ghost. Instead, they looked at the person closest to her. They looked at Adolf Skickel. In the eyes of the law, the tragedy of a murdered young woman needed a swift resolution. And the boyfriend, grieving and shattered, was the easiest target for their suspicion. The interrogation of Adolf Skickel was relentless. Imagine the cold, stark light of the police station, the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, and the weight of an accusation that defies logic. Adolf maintained his innocence, describing their last night together with a clarity born of love, but the authorities saw only a convenient suspect. They pressed him, searching for a crack in his story, while Joachim Kroll sat miles away in his small apartment on Friesenstrasse, perhaps preparing a simple meal or tending to his collection of dolls. The injustice of the situation began to erode Adolf's spirit. The weight of being blamed for the death of the woman he loved, combined with the crushing pressure of the investigation, became a burden too heavy to carry. Overwhelmed by despair and the stigma of the accusation, Adolf eventually traveled to Wiesbaden. There, by the waters of the River Main, he made a final, tragic decision. He leaped from a bridge, ending his life and becoming another indirect victim of the monster, who remained hidden in plain sight. As 1966 gave way to 1967, the shadow of Joachim Kroll only grew longer, though it remained invisible to those who hunted him. He had moved briefly to the town of Greifenhausen, a change of scenery that did nothing to quell the dark impulses that drove him. In this new setting, he adopted a persona that was terrifyingly common for him, that of the friendly, slightly eccentric neighbor. The local children, unaware of the carnage he left in his wake, began to call him Uncle Joachim. He would sit on park benches, a small, balding man with thick glasses, looking like nothing more than a lonely soul seeking a bit of sunlight. It was here, near the edge of a quiet lake, that another near miss occurred, a moment where the thread of his luck was stretched to its absolute limit. In June of 1967, Kroll approached a 10-year-old girl named Gabrielle. He spoke to her with a soft, practiced kindness, promising to show her a rabbit hidden in the tall grass of a nearby meadow. It was a classic ruse, one that had worked before, but this time, the mechanics of fate were beginning to shift. The meadow was lush and green, the air filled with the scent of wild grass and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. Kroll led the young girl away from the safety of the public eye, his hand likely hovering near the pornographic magazines he often carried as a strange sort of psychological fuel. When they reached a secluded spot, his demeanor shifted. The mask of Uncle Joachim slipped, revealing the predator beneath. He detained the girl, his movements turning frantic and aggressive. But as he began his assault, the sound of footsteps approached. A passerby, perhaps a local resident out for a walk or someone drawn by the girl's rising alarm, neared their location. Kroll, ever the coward when faced with direct confrontation, froze. He let go of the girl and retreated into the foliage, disappearing as quickly as a shadow when a light is turned on. It was a profound missed opportunity for the authorities. A simple check of the area, or a more thorough investigation of the strange man in the park, could have ended the nightmare years earlier. Instead, Joachim Kroll simply walked away. He returned to his mundane life, perhaps shaking off the adrenaline of the encounter as easily as one shakes off the rain. He was a man who lived in the cracks of society, protected by his own insignificance. To the police, he didn't fit the profile of a mastermind or a brutal slayer. He was just a worker, a face in the crowd, a man who cleaned toilets and kept to himself. The incident at the lake was filed away, another fragment of a larger puzzle that no one was yet trying to solve. The tragedy of Ursula Rolling and the subsequent death of Adolf Skickel remained a closed chapter in the minds of the local investigators, a domestic tragedy gone wrong. They had no idea that the real killer was already looking toward his next target, his hunger unabated, his methods becoming more refined with every escape. The year 1967 would end with the Ruhr hunter still at large, a predator who found safety in the very water and woods where he left his victims. We must wonder about those moments, the moments where a single question or a lingering look from a witness could have changed everything. Kroll's ability to blend into the industrial landscape of West Germany was his greatest weapon. He was the background noise of the Ruhr, the gray man in the gray coat, moving through the damp parks and along the edges of the lakes where people came to forget their troubles. As we look back at 1967, the missed opportunities feel like a physical weight. The girl who escaped, the man who was falsely accused, the quiet neighbor who watched it all unfold from his window, all of them were pieces of a story that was still being written in blood. For now, the town of Marl and the meadows of Grafenhausen returned to their uneasy peace, the echoes of the incident at the lake fading into the fog. But the hunter is still out there, and the night is far from over. The summer of 1976 was one of relentless, oppressive heat in the industrial heart of the Ruhr Valley. In the district of Lahr, within the city of Duisburg, the air hung heavy with the scent of coal dust and the thick, humid weight of July. It was a time of long shadows and hushed voices. On July 3rd, the neighborhood was already on edge. A little girl, only 4 years old, named Marion Ketter, had vanished from a nearby playground. The innocence of the summer afternoon had been shattered, replaced by a frantic, desperate search that stretched through the streets and alleyways. Imagine the scene. Parents calling out a name that received no answer, the sound of footsteps on hot pavement, and the growing, cold realization that something was terribly wrong. Uniformed officers moved through the tenements, their faces lined with the fatigue of the heat and the gravity of their task. They were conducting a door-to-door canvass, a methodical narrowing of the circle around the place where Marion was last seen. At number 24 Friesen Street, the air inside the hallway of the apartment building was even more stifling than the street outside. It was here that a neighbor, a man frustrated by the mundane inconveniences of life, even amidst a tragedy, approached one of the officers. He had a complaint, a small thing that felt out of place, yet it would become the key that unlocked a door to a nightmare no one was prepared to face. The neighbor spoke of the plumbing. In the shared facilities of the old building, the drains had become sluggish, then completely stopped. It was a nuisance, a foul problem in the sweltering heat. The man told the police that he had run into his neighbor, a quiet, unremarkable man named Joachim Kroll, near the communal bathroom. When asked if he knew why the pipes were blocked, Kroll had looked at him with a flat, unsettling indifference. He didn't offer a typical excuse. He didn't mention paper or waste. Instead, he simply said, "Guts." He had spoken the word as if it were the most natural thing in the world, a casual observation about a household chore gone wrong. The police officer, perhaps sensing a shift in the air, or simply following a lead that felt too strange to ignore, climbed the stairs toward Kroll's small apartment. The hallway was narrow, the floorboards perhaps creaking under the weight of the law. There was a knock, a firm, steady sound that echoed in the quiet corridor. When the door opened, there stood Joachim Kroll. He was 43 years old, a man of small stature, balding, wearing thick spectacles that seemed to magnify his dull, vacant eyes. He did not look like a monster. He looked like the town idiot, a man of low intelligence who had lived a life of quiet, invisible labor, blending into the soot of the industrial landscape. The officers stepped inside, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The room was small, cramped, and filled with a thick, heavy scent that the heat only intensified. It was the smell of a kitchen in the middle of a meal, but there was something metallic and wrong underneath the aroma of cooking. On the stove, a saucepan was simmering. The water bubbled softly, a rhythmic, domestic sound that stood in haunting contrast to what lay within. As the investigators looked closer, the mundane reality of the apartment began to dissolve. There, in the pot, was a small hand. It was a sight that defied the senses, a moment where time seemed to pull taut and snap, revealing the gruesome truth of the man standing before them. The search of the small flat revealed the true extent of the horror that had been hidden behind those thin walls for so long. In the refrigerator, they found plastic bags containing pieces of flesh, carefully stored as if they were nothing more than groceries from the local market. The guts Kroll had mentioned to his neighbor were indeed there, clogging the waste pipes, the remains of a life that had been extinguished only hours before. The evidence was overwhelming, visceral, and undeniable. The circle had finally closed. The man who had eluded capture for over 20 years, moving like a phantom through the industrial fog of the Ruhr, was finally standing in the light of his own terrible deeds. Joachim Kroll did not resist. He did not shout or fight. He sat there, almost placid, as the handcuffs clicked into place. He would later tell the police, with a chilling lack of emotion, that he had taken Marion Ketter because she was there, and that he had used her flesh to save on his grocery bills. It was a confession so stark and devoid of humanity that it left the seasoned investigators in a state of shock. As they led him away from Friesen Street, the neighborhood watched in a stunned silence. The mystery of the Ruhr hunter was over, but the shadows he left behind would linger for decades to come. The circle had narrowed to a single room, a single stove, and a man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The building on Friesenstrasse was a typical, unassuming structure in the industrial landscape of the Ruhr Valley. It was the sort of place where neighbors knew one another by sight, exchanging brief nods in the stairwell as the gray soot of the nearby steel mills settled on the windowsills. Inside, on the upper floor, Joachim Kroll lived in a small, bachelor apartment that was surprisingly tidy, yet strangely crowded. To the children of the neighborhood, he was simply Uncle Joachim, a quiet man who kept his shelves stocked with toys and dolls, a man who seemed more like a gentle eccentric than a threat. But as the investigators crossed the threshold on that July day in 1976, the atmosphere of the room shifted from mundane to suffocating. The air was thick and heavy, carrying a faint, metallic scent that most would have dismissed as plumbing issues in an old building. It was the scent of a secret that had finally outgrown its container. The search began in the most ordinary of places. The detectives moved slowly, their boots echoing on the linoleum floors. In the small kitchen, the light was dim, filtered through a thin curtain that had yellowed over time. On the stove sat a single saucepan, the metal dull and worn from years of use. It looked like any other meal being prepared by a single man in the city of Duisburg. But when the lid was lifted, the reality of Kroll's life was laid bare. Inside the pot, among a mixture of carrots and potatoes, was the small, recognizable hand of 4-year-old Marion Ketter. The horror of the sight caused a seasoned detective, a man who had spent over 20 years facing the worst of humanity, to physically recoil, his knees buckling as the realization hit. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse. It was a systematic, domestic ritual of the unthinkable. Outside the apartment door, the shared toilet in the hallway told another part of the story. A neighbor named Oscar Muller had encountered Kroll only hours before. When Oscar found the toilet blocked, Kroll had looked at him with a flat, expressionless gaze and offered a one-word explanation for the obstruction. Guts. At the time, Oscar had thought it was a crude joke, perhaps a reference to Kroll cleaning a rabbit for his Sunday dinner. But as the police investigated the plumbing, they found the remains of the young girl being flushed away into the dark pipes of the city. The sheer nonchalance of Kroll's admission to his neighbor was perhaps the most chilling detail of all. He had lived with his crimes so long that the vocabulary of death had become his everyday language, spoken with the same indifference one might use to discuss the weather or a broken latch. As the search expanded into the living area, the investigators found evidence of a much deeper, much older darkness. Tucked away in corners and hidden behind stacks of electronic gadgets were various inflatable dolls. These were not toys for the neighborhood children. They were the tools Kroll used to practice his methods. He would later explain, with a detached clarity, how he used these figures to rehearse the acts of strangulation that had claimed so many lives. The apartment was a museum of his fixations. There were candy wrappers and small trinkets intended to lure the innocent, sitting side by side with the tools of a predator. Every item in the room seemed to vibrate with the history of the last 20 years. The police began to realize that the disappearance of Marion Ketter was not the beginning of their investigation, but the final chapter of a long, invisible spree that had haunted the region since the mid-50s. Kroll sat in the middle of this chaos, watching the officers with an eerie, placid curiosity. He was not sweating. His hands did not shake. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, patiently observing the world around him. When the questioning began, he did not reach for excuses or denials. Instead, he began to speak of his budget. He told the investigators that he had committed these acts to save on his grocery bills, a statement so absurd and monstrous that it hung in the air like a cold fog. He spoke of the human body as nothing more than a resource, a way to sustain his quiet, solitary life. As the sun began to set over Duisburg, casting long, orange shadows across the floor of the apartment, Kroll asked for a piece of paper. He said he had things to remember, things that the police would want to know. The list began simply. He wrote down the name of Irmgard Strahl, a young woman from 1955. He provided the date, the location in Ludinghausen, and the specific details of her end. Then, he continued. One name followed another, flowing from his memory with the precision of an accountant. He listed Erika Schuliter from 1956 and Clara Tesmer from 1959. With each name, the weight of the unsolved cases in the Ruhr Valley began to lift from the archives and settle into the small, cramped room on Friesenstrasse. He confessed to 13 murders in total, though he admitted his memory of the exact number was a bit hazy. For 2 decades, he had been the shadow in the park, the figure in the meadows, and the ghost by the river. Now, he was just a small man in a small room, methodically detailing a lifetime of horror as if he were reciting a simple list of chores. The courtroom in Duisburg was a place of heavy, sterile air when the proceedings began in October of 1979. It was known as Room 201, a space defined by polished wood and the cold, unyielding light of a West German autumn. In the center of this legal stage sat a man who appeared entirely unremarkable. Joachim Kroll looked more like a weary office clerk than a predator who had haunted the Ruhr Valley for over 2 decades. He sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, his mousy hair thinning, and his large glasses reflecting the overhead lights. To the families of the victims gathered in the gallery, the sight of him was a chilling paradox. How could a man so seemingly simple, so quiet, carry within him such a vast and dark landscape of cruelty? The trial was not merely a presentation of evidence. It was the slow, painful uncovering of a shadow that had lived among them, unnoticed and unchallenged, for 21 years. As the prosecution began to read the charges, the atmosphere in the room turned brittle. Kroll was officially charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, though the true scope of his crimes was far broader. He had confessed to 14 killings in total, but the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence for the older cases meant the law could only reach so far. What struck the observers most was Kroll's behavior as the most gruesome details were recounted. He did not flinch. He did not weep. He listened to the descriptions of the young lives he had extinguished as if he were hearing a lecture on a subject of mild interest. There was no heat in him, no visible rage, only a flat, robotic detachment that made the skin of those nearby crawl. He spoke of his victims not as people with dreams and futures, but as items of necessity, often citing the high cost of groceries as a reason for his cannibalism. The psychiatric evaluations were perhaps the most anticipated part of the trial. Doctors and specialists spent hundreds of hours peeling back the layers of Kroll's consciousness, trying to determine if he was a man driven by madness or by a calculated, albeit primitive, malice. They found a man with an intelligence quotient of 76, a level of mental functioning that was borderline but not legally incapacitated. The experts described him as possessing a primitive personality structure. He was a man of limited vocabulary and simple needs, yet he was capable of complex deception and long-term planning. Crucially, the psychiatrists concluded that he was legally sane. He knew that what he was doing was wrong in the eyes of the law, but he lacked the emotional equipment to care. To Kroll, the world was a predatory place, and he had simply functioned within his own dark logic, driven by a sexual sadism that was as much a part of him as the air he breathed. Perhaps the most surreal aspect of the trial was Kroll's own perspective on his situation. He expressed a naive belief that his killings were the result of a biological malfunction, a physical illness that could be corrected. He frequently asked the court for a surgical operation, convinced that a simple procedure on his brain would cure him of his urges and allow him to return home to his quiet life in Lar. He spoke of his crimes with a terrifying nonchalance, once explaining to the investigators that he chose his victims based on who looked like they would provide the most tender meat. This utilitarian view of human life was so foreign to the court that it created a sense of profound unease. It wasn't just that he had committed these acts. It was that he seemed to lack the very concept of remorse. To him, the trial was an inconvenience on the path to a medical solution that would never come. The trial stretched on for 151 days, a marathon of misery that exhausted the court and the public alike. Each day, new pieces of the puzzle were laid out. The fragments of clothing, the testimony of neighbors who had noticed the strange smells, and the agonizing accounts of those who had narrowly escaped his grasp. The weight of the evidence was insurmountable. By the time the proceedings reached their conclusion in April of 1982, there was no doubt left in the minds of the judges. The shadow had been fully exposed. The man in the glasses, the quiet toilet attendant who had lived a life of invisible horror, was finally standing at the edge of his own reckoning. The judge's voice was steady, but heavy with the gravity of the moment, as he prepared to deliver a sentence that would ensure the Ruhr hunter would never walk beneath the sun as a free man again. On April 8, 1982, the verdict was read. Joachim Kroll was found guilty on all counts. Because West Germany had abolished the death penalty years earlier, the maximum punishment available was life imprisonment. The court sentenced him to 8 consecutive life sentences. It was a symbolic and practical wall of time, ensuring that even if he lived for a century, he would remain behind bars. As the sentence was handed down, Kroll remained as stoic as ever, perhaps still clinging to the hope of his surgical cure. He was led away from the courtroom and transported to the prison in Rheinbach. The trial of the shadow was over, leaving behind a community scarred by the knowledge of what had lived among them. The case was closed, but the echoes of his footsteps in the parks and meadows of the Ruhr would remain in the collective memory for generations to come. The iron gates of Reinbach prison closed with a finality that the people of the Ruhr Valley had awaited for over 2 decades. Following the verdict in April of 1982, Joachim Kroll was no longer the phantom of the forest or the shadow in the stairwell. He was merely a number, a quiet presence within the thick, gray walls of a cell near the city of Bonn. The trial had lasted 151 days, a marathon of horror that had forced a nation to stare into the abyss of his kitchen and his crimes. But as the media circus packed its bags and the headlines faded into yellowing archives, the silence of the prison began. Here, the air was different, heavy with the scent of damp stone and the metallic tang of heavy locks. For Kroll, life became a rhythm of small spaces and narrow corridors, far removed from the parks and riverbanks where he once hunted. In the confined world of the correctional facility, Joachim Kroll was an anomaly. To the other inmates, he was often a ghost, small, balding, and wearing thick spectacles that seemed to magnify his vacant stare. He did not possess the typical bravado of a condemned man. Instead, he remained remarkably soft-spoken, almost polite, as if he were still the unassuming toilet attendant who had once worked for the steel mills of Thyssen. He spent his hours in a state of strange, clinical detachment. While the world outside remembered him as a monster, Kroll often spoke to prison psychiatrists with a chilling lack of self-awareness. He truly believed, in his simple way, that he was merely sick. He harbored a quiet, delusional hope that the doctors would grant him a simple operation, a surgery to remove the urges that lived inside him, and that once the procedure was done, he would be allowed to walk free and return to his gadgets and his dolls. He did not see the lives he had extinguished as people, but as components of a dark, biological necessity. But the echo in his cell was not just his own voice. It was the weight of the innocent men whose lives had been crushed in the machinery of his evasion. As Kroll sat in the dim light of Reinbach, the names of those wrongly accused hung in the air like a cold mist. There was Heinrich Ott, the local mechanic who had been arrested for a crime Kroll committed in 1959. Driven to despair by a system that could not see the real predator, Ott had taken his own life in his cell. There were others, men whose reputations were shattered, whose families were torn apart by the suspicion that they were the Ruhr hunter. Kroll's legacy was not just the 8 murders for which he was convicted, or the 14 he eventually confessed to. It was the psychological fracture he caused in the community, a deep-seated paranoia that turned neighbors against one another while the true killer lived quietly in their midst, complaining about the price of meat. The years drifted by in a slow, gray procession of seasons seen through barred windows. By the time the summer of 1991 arrived, Kroll had spent nearly a decade in the stillness of Reinbach. He was 58 years old, his body finally beginning to reflect the stagnation of his spirit. On the 1st of July, 1991, the end came with no grand drama and no final words of remorse. It was a sudden failure of the heart, a sharp, internal collapse that silenced the man who had once terrified an entire region. There was no one there to hold his hand, no one to mourn the passing of the Duisburg man-eater. He died in the same anonymity he had used as a shield during his decades of hunting. The news of his death was a small footnote, a closing of a ledger that many had wished to burn long ago. The man was gone, but the echo of his crimes remained etched into the soil of the North Rhine-Westphalia landscape. The psychological scar left by Joachim Kroll did not heal with his heart attack. For the people of Duisburg, Essen, and the small villages along the Rhine, the world had changed forever between 1955 and 1976. Parents who had grown up during his reign of terror passed down a new kind of vigilance to their children, a fear of the ordinary, a suspicion of the quiet neighbor who never makes a sound. The case forced German law enforcement to rewrite their understanding of the criminal mind, proving that a man with a low intelligence quotient could still outmaneuver the most sophisticated investigators if he was sufficiently invisible. The files on Kroll are now thick with dust, kept in high-security archives where the details of his cannibalism and his cruelty are preserved as a grim warning. The parks where he once walked are now peaceful again, the sounds of the city masking the memories of the screams that were ignored for 21 years. As we pull back from the cold stone of Reinbach and the dark history of the Ruhr, we leave the shadow of Joachim Kroll behind. The horror has been spoken, the facts have been laid bare, and the monster has returned to the earth. There is nothing left to fear in the silence of the night. The streets are still, the windows are dark, and the story has reached its final page. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.